All right, good morning, Benjamin Hadfield. Teach me to dive. We are really blessed today to have Dr. Mithriel MacKay. Now, if you don't know Dr. Mithriel MacKay, you should, because Mithriel MacKay is a PhD in and the Director of Research and Education for the Marine and Coastal Ecology Research Center. And what does that mean? That sounds really big and really cool. Well, does behavioral and ecological, evolutionary and biological anatomy and physiology of marine research, specializing in humpback whales in the North Atlantic. Now, we're also blessed that she collaborates often with citizen scientists like myself who really like whales and just love seeing whales. And she helps people and educate people like myself what's going on, gets all the junk out of the way. Mithriel, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me. I love sharing what I do, so I'm happy to get into this.
So let's just jump into the middle of it. How do you become a doctor of whales?
Oh, wow, that's a really great question. And it depends on who you are and what you like to do. For me, I started off as living in Massachusetts. I grew up with parents that came from a beach town, knew I wanted to study whales. When it came time to go to college, that's what I began with. And then life happened, so I got sidetracked, but I stayed in science. And so my background is clinical laboratory medicine and as a paramedic. So my science stayed in the discovery kind of mode. And then as my kids grew older and graduated, one of my kids who was getting his master's degree said, "Mom, you need to go back to school. You need to be an instructor in all these things that you've been doing." And I laughed and I said, "Oh, I'm kind of settled. You guys are grown." And then I thought about it and said, I could circle back to do what I started doing, which was marine biology and wanting to study whales. So I went and got my master's degree in marine resources management at Texas A&M in the Galveston campus, because I wanted to be able to effectively understand everybody who had an interest in what I was doing and talk to them about it. And then I went on to get my PhD with Dr. Bernd Versig at Texas A&M Galveston, who's one of the most brilliant and founding researchers in what I do. And so that's how I got there, doing all that work and then getting myself out in the water.
Neat. So I want to get this out of the way. There's a lot of misconceptions about marine life, specifically with humpback whales and killer whales. Let's just jump out. What's the stupidest thing you hear about humpback whales that is just absolutely not true?
So I don't think I hear anything stupid, but some of the misconceptions are people have a lot of confidence sometimes in what they see in some of the short videos and reels that are on social media. And they don't understand that the people that are presenting those are reading the science, which is wonderful. I'm glad everybody's excited, but misinterpreting what they read. So for humpback whales, I think they're the most familiar of all the species of whales. I think relating them to things like windmills are hurting them and those kind of real triggering things that if we put in these wind farms, which are a great source of renewable energy, that we're killing humpback whales with those. And so that's probably the one misconception I wish people would look more towards the people who do the research on this and understand that's not what some of these, these strandings and things that they're reading about are coming from. For other animals, I guess what I want to say first is if somebody puts something up in social media and they don't have edu after their website name, or they're not well known when you click on their name, kind of do a little bit more homework and dig out things. So, dolphins getting high on puffer fish, that's an automatic, well, that's really cool, that's triggering. That's your first clue that maybe you should look a little bit harder about whether or not that's true. And spoiler alert, it's not. So
puffer fish and dolphin. The funny thing is we talked about that prior to coming on live, and you mentioned, and I actually had not heard that one. So people have the misconception that dolphins are eating puffer fish to get high.
Well, there's a legitimate reason that hit social media. There was a film that was done, and I'm not going to call out any companies that did it because they're all great. There was a film that was done by a well-meaning person that was on it, and he observed dolphins playing with a pufferfish and made the leap and said that out loud on film. And of course, the people that edited it relied on him to have the right information. And that's great news to put that out there. But when you look into the science, when they put their mouth on a pufferfish and they squish it, what would happen to their body is not getting high. And if you think about dolphins, people might not know dolphins have to consciously think about breathing. So if they're high and they don't think about that, they would drown. That's wouldn't be a really good plan. Their calves would be more vulnerable to predators. That wouldn't work out very well. There's a lot of reasons it just doesn't make sense from a behavioral point of view that it would work. They do like to play, so they probably are entertained by squishing these things and they go poof. Yeah, because they're very curious and mouthy, and they do like to play, but that's not what's happening chemically. So again, it's one of those things that makes cool noise. It makes cool news, but it's worth doing a little bit more homework, and then you find out, well, it's not quite what it sounds like it would be.
Absolutely. What other great ones have you heard that how about with killer whales? Anything interesting with killer whales?
The biggest thing I hear about killer whales that bothers me, so I love that people love killer whales and they get excited about it, but people tend to grab onto something they hear and then it sort of does that telephone game where it changes the context. And I actually made a video about this, that people will say killer whales are the biggest animal in the dolphin family. And that's absolutely true. Killer whales are dolphins, and they are the biggest species, the biggest family in Delphinidae. So what they don't understand is that they're also whales. So all the dolphins fall under the toothed whales, the odontocetes, and both the toothed whales and the baleen whales, the ones that filter feed, they all fall under the cetaceans, which actually means whale if you look at the root word in the original languages. So all dolphins are whales. So when people get into these arguments online about whether the dolphins are whales and should we call them orca or killer whales, I wish that people would understand that it's okay to call them either whales or dolphins. They're both correct, and not argue over who's correct on that. Instead, go look at the behaviors that they do and recognize that all of these different ecotypes, these different groups around every ocean in the world have some really cool social behaviors. And that's what we should be focusing on, not fighting over what we call them or where they belong.
Absolutely. Okay, let's get it out of the way. I think we've all heard that person say, "Oh my gosh, there's a killer whale. We're all going to die." How many deaths are attributed or injuries are attributed to humans for killer whales?
0. That's the easy answer. Now, people are going to say, "What about in captivity?" That's a different path that you go down. But if you are in the water with a killer whale, you're not on their menu. Now, there's a lot going out in the Strait of Gibraltar with all the boats that's making the news and killer whales pulling apart. Some of these boats that are out there on the rudders and sinking them. And so people are in the water. So indirectly, I can understand the fear and the anxiety that surrounds, well, they may not be trying to eat us for lunch, but you put people in the water in their boat, and then there's a risk to their safety. So I get that part. But you're not on the menu. If you're on your paddleboard and they come and they're curious about what you do, or you're swimming in areas that have killer whales, if they come and meet up with you, they're big, so they're intimidating, but you're not on their menu, so you're okay.
Now, it's interesting. The Strait of Gibraltar, I'm glad you brought that up. And I think one of the things people don't realize is it seems like they're almost combining together and hunting in groups. Do killer whales hunt in groups?
They can. So I mentioned the word ecotype. So let's just kind of talk about what an ecotype is.
Sure.
And eco, that prefix, you can think of ecology. So the surrounding that they're in, what they eat, what they look like, they tend to be genetically isolated. So in other words, those groups of killer whales are probably not mixing genes with other ecotypes that are having a different orbit in maybe the same or a different environment. So if you are, you eat what's in your neighborhood. And I think most people recognize the killer whale ecotypes that are up in the western, northern United States and, Canada, the Washington, BC area of Canada. So southern resident whale, Biggs killer whales that used to be called transients. And we recognize that the one ecotype eats fish, specifically salmon. The other ecotype is predominantly marine mammals. So there's two different groups living in the same area, and they've each found their own ecological niche in the same area. So they're not competing with each other. And that's why they're successful there. But then there are so many different ecotypes, and we don't know them all. There are groups in California. One recently made the news with a colleague of mine that published with some other people about more information about an ecotype and what they're eating and how they're behaving. And then there are some offshore types. So their diet depends on where they live. They might have a varied diet. So they may have fish, but also rays and marine mammals. Where I study, we're really just learning about what the North Atlantic killer whales and the Caribbean are eating. We don't know a whole lot about the Gulf of Mexico either, but the indications are there's at least one ecotype. And the ones that I've been studying, I know they at least eat marine mammals, specifically humpback whales. They're grabbing some of the calves. So the short answer is, it depends on the group, just like humans. If you live in a place where you are able to only fish, then that's what you're going to eat, whatever comes out of the ocean. But if you're in a place where we particularly farm, then those are the things that are going to be on your menu. And if you travel far away and see what we call exotic foods, right, because they're different, it's you eat what's in your neighborhood. And so killer whales do the same thing. And there's a misconception that I often hear that if something happens to what they're eating now, they'll just switch. But it's important to remember that their anatomy and physiology also adapt to what they've been eating over millennia. And so if you suddenly take a human and you take away all our food and you say the only thing left are bugs, are we built to find insects in dirt enough to sustain us? And can our anatomy and physiology, the way we digest and absorb things, support our body? So it depends. It depends on what they are. It depends on how many are in the group. Sometimes they hunt pairs, sometimes alone. It just really depends on what they're going after.
Absolutely. That's really interesting that they're eating the humpback whale calves as well.
Mm-hmm.
So moving on to kind of humpback whales, there's a lot of stuff going on with that and a lot of research as well. And by the way, congratulations on the series that just got published on Disney Plus on the Explorers. That has to have been super exciting. I'm going to share my screen so everybody can kind of see what we're talking about. Tell us a little bit about Ocean Explorers.
This group of people that got together to make it possible for some of us to do work we wouldn't be able to do are phenomenal. I can't even begin to say how wonderful and generous they are and how focused they are on science and bringing it to people. So the ship, the Ocean Explorer, is owned by Ocean X. The Dalios bought the ship with this is the second version that they've had. So the purpose is to be able to bring science to a level that hasn't been possible before, because the technology really needs to be cutting edge for a lot of us to move forward. And the resources, the assets to do that are just really impossible in some cases to get to. So their mission is to create this vessel, this floating science platform with cutting edge, state-of-the-art assets. And that means submersibles, small vessels. They have a helicopter on board and dry labs and wet labs, everything you could possibly need. But they also have a state-of-the-art media operation going there. And I won't pretend to know I know anything about media. Everything I learned from them on this mission, and invited us on board. And then they got together with National Geographic, BBC. So we had 3 entities get together on one ship to make the series under James Cameron, who I don't think he needs any introduction in the film industry, and he narrates this. And I'm very glad because his tone of voice couldn't be more perfect for the way I was hoping it would be presented. And they asked us, what do you need from us? What do you want to do? And if they could put it in our hands, we did it. And so they reached out to me. First contact was with BBC to find out whether or not we were a good fit for the series and what they were trying to do, and really try to inspire people that are younger to kind of continue with what we're doing and let them know there's a lot to be done and how important it is. And when we realized that we were a good fit with each other, then invited us on board during COVID. So that was a couple of weeks of quarantining ahead of time. It was a crazy time. And, and I never get to say this, but it wasn't easy. One of the things that people see when they watch this film is some of the really cool stuff. There's a lot of cool stuff that they obviously had to edit to tell the story, but it wasn't easy. And so one of the things that I think really made this successful was that everybody knew COVID was difficult to begin with. And if we were going to make this happen together, then the usual stuff that you do when you're in a small place with a bunch of people on board a ship, we were going to have to go above and beyond that. And when things got hard, we were just going to have to suck it up and make it work, because that's what it would take. And everybody did that. And so I can't even emphasize enough all of that. And then they said, what do you want to do? And where should we go today? What would make your research successful? And a colleague of mine, Carrie Seger, Dr. Seger is a specialist in acoustics in my field. And we met years ago when I needed an acoustic specialist. I reached out to her. So we've been consulting. I help her with behavior stuff when she needs it. She helps me with acoustics. And so we really need her on board to do one of these things I want to do. So she also was part of the team and came on board with us. And we did some really cool research and paired together before we got on and while we were on to make that work, and then the analysis afterwards.
Wow.
So it's hard to explain how surreal it is when somebody says to you, our budget of course is small, and we always spend all the money on what we do because we want to put it in reach of up and coming scientists and citizen scientists to join us. And they just said, well, the sky's the limit. What do you want to do? And it just took my breath away. And we did it. And because of that, we were able to discover things I did not think in my lifetime were going to be possible about humpback whales and humpback whales.
Wow. That it begs the question, though. Give me an example of something you didn't think you discovered in this lifetime that you picked up.
Well, one of the things that was on the show, which is really great, is that we did this amphitheater hypothesis, and they show you the HoloLab, the Microsoft team, which took images out of my brain and turned them into this 3D reality by using the mapping and that the ship had done and a lot of other high-tech, cutting-edge technology to make this 3D reality that we could share with other people. And we used that so that I could explain better to Carrie what I had seen out in the field and what I tripped over. So we would go out. I work in a low-density area, not a lot of whales. We had a hard time finding them the first couple of years. We built a directional hydrophone out of a stainless steel salad bowl, PVC, the electronic hydrophone in it, and a yoga mat. And it worked phenomenal. Really well. So we would put this pole over and somebody would have earphones on and we'd do just what you think, turn it left to right, 360 degrees. We hear whales singing this way, louder that way. The problem is that at least half the time we would follow the loudest song and we couldn't find the whale. It wasn't there. And it was confusing until I got up in a small airplane and did some aerial surveys and noticed that some of the humpback whales, one day we saw 7, were singing in these parabola shape, these half circle shape areas in the side of some of these features underwater. And I had talked to Carrie for years about this and said, I really think they're using this to amplify their sound the way you do in an amphitheater. And there's got to be a benefit to it because it's not just one whale doing this. This is many whales that I'm observing doing this. And so what we got to do on the Ocean Explorer was to first map it out in the HoloLab. So we got a 3D version. And Carrie would do that with the team based on acoustics. And then they would say, okay, take another look. And I would say, well, that's not quite what I saw. So we had a plan before we got on board, and we were able to troubleshoot some of the experiment ahead of time in virtual reality, which you don't typically get to do. You go out there and say, why isn't it working? And then you try again and say, oh, that's why. So by visualizing it in this way, we were able to say, okay, we really knew where we wanted to go. Then we put the ship somewhere. And you can see Carrie putting out the hydrophones with Eric on the top with those floatophones that she designed and I built and in my garage. So typical garage science. She had half of them. The other half, I went down in the submersible, and Zuleika and I, with, of course, the amazing operators of the submersibles, placed them on a cliff. So that experiment about being able to put these underwater microphones in the water column, broadcasting some humpback whale song towards these features that I saw humpback whales sing, and then measure what comes back, and then analyze whether or not, yeah, that works, was something we couldn't do otherwise. So that's one experiment that we were able to do. The other one was, you saw the tagging, and the Dominican Republic gave me a permit to be able to do pretty much everything but fly a spaceship while I was out there. So when we were out there tagging humpback whales, which we intended to do, and get these, critter cams and a lot of other measurements on them, I talked to Carrie before we went, and I said, look, where I'm asking to put this ship, I fully expect at this point to see killer whales going after humpback whales. The timing, the location, everything is the next step on my research anyway. And so if we see killer whales, we're going to tag them. And that's what happened. We were in the right place and the right time and the right circumstances with the right plan and the right equipment and the right assets because of the Ocean Explorer to be able to tag killer whales. And so we ended up putting a tag on the killer whale and the humpback whale calf in the same predation event. And what we saw when we analyzed that is nothing short of amazing.
Wow. That is amazing. That is absolutely spectacular. So now it begs the question. You said they gave you a permit for everything, but to fly a spaceship, did you apply for the spaceship permit, or just forget that one?
No, I left that one out. But maybe my experience wasn't quite that broad.
You never know. If you had applied, maybe they'd have given it to you. So with humpback whales, there's a lot of interesting things, and you've been talking and researching and understanding them for a long time now. And there's a fair amount of research out there. In these long-term studies, what have been the most significant behavioral changes you've noticed in these Atlantic humpback whales over the time of your research?
Well, there's a lot of things. I work in low density areas, and what that means is without as many whales there, I'm on the breeding ground. So these animals are coming down to mate, and they're coming down to have their calves. And most people that want to do research go to places where there are a lot of their research subjects. And for me, what I found is working in this area mostly between Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic in that particular area, is that without so many whales in there, I could see behaviors that you typically can't see in a crowd, that kind of sorted out a little bit easier. And now that we have things like accelerated climate change going on, things are shifting. Humpback whales are notorious for changing where they are, especially up in the feeding grounds any given year. They follow the food and their food moves around. But now that accelerated climate change is shifting where the waters are bringing their food, it's shifting the behaviors of where humpback whales are going, and also the time of the year and how much time they're spending in the lower latitudes towards the equator. There's always been a lot of question about why they even do this big migration? And so those are questions that all of us are working on, and I think we're getting closer to. But this whole shift is really important to understand because it helps us kind of use them as a barometer to the bigger ecological picture in the oceans. And as change happens, we can follow the changes in behaviors of these particular animals and say, okay, something's going on here, everything's connected. How do we address that? How do we mitigate that? And so that's kind of where humpback whales are. And knowing that their seasons change and their locations change, and their numbers have increased greatly since whaling stopped in the North Atlantic as well, that the dynamics of where they overlap activity with humans is changing. So we're having to look at all that.
So as we look at the change, and we get the idea that whales are going to go where the food is at. That makes perfect sense to me. Absolutely. So if they're changing their dynamic where they're at, what's causing the food to change in those areas? Is it climate? Is it fishing? What's causing that?
That's a loaded question, and it's really complicated. So I'll try to give you the cut down answer. Since everything's connected, when the whole Earth in general warms up and the polar caps melt, one of the big things that we all know is that heat rises, right? Heat rises, cold drops. We know that in the air, in your car, when you put a ceiling fan up. The same thing is true with water. So when all that fresh water melts and it goes up into the oceans in the poles, well, in this case, we'll talk about the North Pole, then it changes the currents, it changes the direction, it changes the speed, it slows down some things. And the way the whole food chain works is it's got to be seeded somewhere. And that's at the bottom of the ocean. There's all these, minerals. So for us, it's like vitamin and minerals are what we take, right? That's in the bottom of the ocean. And the way this whole thing gets primed is those things sitting on the bottom get swirled up to the top. And they're brought up to the top in all those ocean dynamics. So when you change the ocean dynamics from the very top where it starts at the poles and it circulates through the entire globe, that affects on where, when, how much these nutrients that seed the whole chain go. And so if you change where the nutrients are, then you change with the little things that eat the nutrients. And then you change the little bigger things that eat those things. And, the small fish eat the big fish, eat the small fish, and all the way up. And so a lot of these things moving closer to shore, and that's in some places that'll move humpback whales closer to shore. And that means there's more activity closer to shore where humans are. So the shifting of the climate shifts the dynamics of the oceans, and the dynamics of the oceans shift everything in the oceans. And there's a big, complicated web of things that feed into that I'm not qualified to explain to you. It would take all of us in our different disciplines to put those pieces together. But that's the important part. So that's going to change everything we depend on the ocean for as well.
That's amazing. So let's kind of move out of that. It's a really big question. It's a great question. We definitely need to protect our oceans and be more cognizant of that as well through our daily lives and single-use plastics as well. So long conversation with that for another time. But moving on with humpback whales, how do the social structures among humpback whales influence their behavior and interactions, especially in terms of things like mating or migration?
You ask great questions, and they're big global questions. So let me hone in a little bit on some of the cool stuff that people really like to hear based on social media and conversations that they have. The social structure for humpback whales, we talk about, we kind of separate them into a little bitty groups. So we talk about adult males and their behaviors. And this is what I do. I study behaviors as a clue. So you go out there and you see something, you go, what's happening? And if one animal's doing that, you go, oh, okay, that's interesting. But that's kind of an anomaly. So if they're all doing this behavior, then I say, there must be a reason for that. And if that behavior is within a whole species of animals or even a population, then I said there's got to be an advantage to that, because the advantages are the ones that are continuing, and the things that are disadvantaged are selected out. So We talk about adult humpback whale males. They sing. When people talk about that humpback whale song that permeates all of media and the background, it's the males that do that. That's important. And then we talk about the adult females. And of course, the adult females want a calf. And they have a different kind of social behavior that I'll get to in a second. And then we have subadult males and we have subadult females that are, they're not calves, but they're not in breeding age yet. And so each one of their behaviors are different. Adult males will sing, and there's a lot of information in that song. Some we're starting to understand, some will take a while. We know that they start to sing on the feeding grounds before they migrate, and most of the singing happens after they've migrated several thousand miles and aggregate somewhere on the breeding grounds together. Mm-hmm. And then we have the adult females that go down, and they're getting information out of that song. Some of the work in Hawaii has shown that females will select out some of the bigger humpback whale males. Very likely true in the Caribbean. Really hard to do that kind of study, but that they're getting information out of that. And then other males around them are listening to those males sing, and they're definitely getting information out of that song. So the whole social structure tends to be aggregating in a group and mixing up in the breeding grounds in the warmer waters in the winter. Females will have their calves. They tend to stay close to shore out of those really dynamic fight clubs that these animals are having, where all the males get together and just pound the heck out of each other to get to a female. And then they all split up. And then you have the subadult males, where I see some in Puerto Rico coming down and singing, but not near the big group. So there's questions to answer about why that's happening. And the subadult females don't tend to come all the way down. So there's got to be a reason for that. And then females that had a calf last year tend to not migrate. They tend to rest up north where there's food. So the social structure tends to be kind of loose and dynamic, depending on whether they're feeding together up north or whether they're in the breeding group and they're just trying to either make babies or they're taking the time to have babies. So like everything else, it's complicated.
That brings up some really interesting questions as we got it. So only males sing is what I'm getting from that. I didn't realize that. That's new. So how close are we coming to cracking the song code?
Wow. I don't know the answer to that. I know that with my work that we're at the point where we're ready to do some analysis to find out one particular part of it. I'm not an acoustic person, so I don't do those analyses, and I suspect that a lot of acoustic people are probably all in the same place across the globe. And it's kind of, I think of it like a double-sided jigsaw puzzle that's 1,000 pieces, that as soon as you start putting some of the pieces together, it's a little bit easier to put the other pieces into the puzzle. So how close are we? I can only guess. It seems like there's probably a lot of acoustic work that's going to pop up. We know with sperm whales that some of that's been decoded and understood. And so that'll probably give some more hints to the acoustic people for humpback whales and other species to do their stuff. Yeah, there you go.
Here we go. Hopefully someday. It sounds like
it'll be that long. I don't really think it's going to be that long before people start saying, look, this is all that's going on. And I don't really have good, robust analysis to kind of give away what we're about to do. But I can say that it seems like it's always about technology. You can only go so fast until the technology keeps up, and the technology is driven by what you want to answer. So like the flotophones, you have the question, nobody's done it before, so you have to build the equipment you need. So I think we're kind of there. And with AI, that's all coming into play to make it a lot easier to do that analysis. But acoustics, I heavily rely on my colleagues to do that work.
You bring up another great question. How has AI affected your research of whales?
It hasn't yet. It's about to. Well, no, that's not true, because actually the catalog that we all submit pictures of the humpback whale flukes, those tail patterns, is based on AI. Ted Cheeseman and Happy Whale has put together that whole thing. And so we've gone from having to wait months to see whether that whale's been sighted somewhere else to, I mean, when we were out in the Dominican Republic, he matched that in a couple of days so that we knew who the mother of the calf was that was being hunted. So it's fast tracking a lot of things. It's making analysis a lot easier. My particular work, not quite as much, because again, I go out there and look at behaviors and say, okay, I'm great at looking at behaviors on a very fine scale and saying that's a clue. So I kind of tip off the people that are doing the AI in the next step by saying there's something going on here. This is what I see, and this is when I see it. And right now, our analysis is not using AI, but I also have this thing with AI, like artificial intelligence is anything that's computer driven, right? We've come to know it as, we think of it as this magic robot computer that's doing everything for us. We just say, blah, 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 here's all our data, and it spits it all out. But every time you have some kind of analysis that's computer driven, it's kind of artificial intelligence. So,
fair enough. We've been using AI with Google Maps for years. We just didn't realize it. Fair enough. And the latest dynamic is like ChatGPT is the easiest one to pick on, right? There's a whole mess of them out there, but that's seems like the front leader that we hear about, that we can suddenly take 40 pages of research, copy, paste it, put it into the chat and say, what do you think? And it pops out this massive whales with a white stripe are more prone to do this than others. So it's
what we're doing right now, and I think I can say this because it's, we're not giving away anything, but that's super, super cool, is that during this predation event that we saw in the film, we got a lot of data. And so I've spent hundreds of thousands of hours in the last 3 years going through and coding every single microscopic, thousandth of a second behavior. So every time I see this particular thing, I give it a number. And Carrie has used programs that she uses for her acoustics to code acoustics that she hears. So any sound, some she recognizes, some are different. And what's happening now is we're putting them together. I haven't told her the behaviors. She hasn't told me the acoustics. She's putting them back into the computer programs that she uses, and it will tell us if we have matches and how often. So if I say, oh, I saw this, and she said, oh, I heard this, and then we get it together and say, every time Mithriel saw this and Carrie heard this behavior is what happened, and be able to match those. So that it's not what people think of as AI, but it is using computer-generated assistance to help us make those kinds of analyses. So the more the tech gets better, the better our analysis gets.
No, absolutely. The more we can match data more quickly, and AI can certainly do that very easily for us in a much more accurate and much more dynamic way as well. I use it in my own as I'm going through and doing research on my own of different things to help match and place things together. That it's like playing Huskadoo, right? You try and match the cards and match the things, and the computer just knows it automatically. If it sees it once, it will always remember that this is there. It's amazing. So that's fantastic. So as we kind of move forward on this, how about cultural transmission? What have you noticed evidentially wise with cultural transmission among humpbacks, like passing down songs or feeding patterns or things like those?
Well, there's a few things. So, when we talk about all this, one of the things we have to remember is, so what? People always say, oh, you spend all this money and time, so what? Learning these things lets us back out. And hopefully, once we match the behaviors with the sounds, we don't have to be in the middle of this. We can go backwards and listen to sounds and say, oh, now we know what was going on in that group. So we don't have to be as closer in the middle of it. And then we can move forward and say, well, now we see some changes and now we can understand what's going on. So some of the more economically important things, like telling fishermen where whales are going to be feeding, might give them an idea of where not to put their nets and not lose their gear and that kind of thing. And with cultural transmission, what you're talking about is this vertical and this horizontal. So some animals will teach the same generation, and some will teach the next generation, right? You're on mute. I totally just lost you.
I am, as a matter of fact. I want to turn my lights back on real quick. Sorry.
So when we do this, it's the humpback whales are teaching each other some things, and we're learning some things that we've already taught each other. In this case, it's very likely, like in Hawaii, that there's site fidelity, that mothers that give birth to calves in certain areas, those females calves may come back and have their young right there. As far as their behaviors go, teaching each other where to be safe to have your calf, teaching each other song when they come down. That song changes every year a little bit, and it gradually changes over time. And so if they don't come down and sing together, they're not going to be able to know what the latest song is going to be. So those kinds of things in humpbacks are probably things people don't think of as cultural transmission. The killer whales that we saw in this group, we had two small groups come together, and it's very clear that they worked together before. They were changing behaviors and different plays on the fly. When that mother was a very experienced mother, it was evident, and then we found out her age. She's had probably 8 or 9 calves before. So she was very good at recovering her calf from them, but they worked together in some coordinated plays and gave each other signals to do things that had been taught and practiced before they were in a hunt. So that's also cultural transmission, and that will be passed on to generations. What's the best way to hunt these animals? Well, the humpback whales are learning what's the best way to avoid hunting these animals. So they kind of move together. Right? That's how evolution works anyway. One pressure drives the other behavior. So we can see all these things being taught about where to live, where to eat, how to get there, where to find food, who to hang out with, what to listen to. And then with these other group of animals, like, okay, well, they're doing that. So now we know how to hunt, how to get together, where to find them, how to communicate with each other in the middle of that. That's all cultural transmission.
It's interesting. So I guess my question kind of develops deeper into that. As we start talking about their songs, their communication, is it a growth communication or an evolutionary communication? And what I mean by that is, if we went back to Middle England in the 1200s, it would be a different communication, different words, different growth, different complexities of it. The original Native Americans didn't have a word for horse. They called it a big dog. That's the closest they could equivalent. Has the whale songs and whale communication evolved and grown over the course of your career and the course of your studies?
So my career in studies is a blanket evolutionary time. So probably not on a small scale. I mean, the idea that they changed their song is something they've been doing for a very long time. There's an advantage to doing that we need to understand what that is. And I have some ideas what that is, and some things that we'll test as some more years go by, what the advantage might be towards that. So it's such a blink in time right now that what people don't typically understand is when you do science, you just get that grain of sand and that one brick in the Empire State Building at a time. And that's just the way it works. You have to do a tiny piece. And then it sort of picks up momentum in an area. So as we get better at acoustics and communication and our AI technology that takes what we know, we feed it into the computer, and it can pull out these patterns and trends, we'll learn more about it. But to try to decide whether this has been going on for a while, we really haven't recorded humpback whale songs that long. We don't have that kind of technology over more than a few decades. So I can say probably, but a lot of it's been maintained longer. So we just don't know. And people don't realize we haven't been studying whales that long. Really, the first work that was done was in the 50s on whaling boats. It's not that long. It was before my time, but not much before my time, that we even began to study whales. And none of the tech was there. So our understanding of what's been going on is really not that long ago.
That's fascinating. So as we start, you bring in whaling boats, and that's an interesting idea to think about at this point. So what are some of the biggest conservation challenges facing humpback whales today, and how is research really helping create that protection for them?
The biggest challenges. Okay, so accelerated climate change is this big umbrella of challenges. And I think my personal opinion is the number one challenge that's facing everybody today is that we're not good at talking to each other. So I typically am really good at being a liaison between different humans. I grew up in New England, and a lot of my family was involved in fishing culture one way or another. And so I get the fishing culture in New England. I get that you can't just walk up to somebody and say, "Stop fishing. Just stop fishing. You know, we want you to stop fishing for this reason, this reason, this." There are a lot of reasons you can't do that. And that's tied into not just culture of fishing, but economics, and that trickles down through a lot of people. And then you have people that understand that we have more whales out there because it's been such a success since whaling has stopped in the North Atlantic. So now we have this interaction that overlaps. So we have people that just can't seem to sit across the table from each other and listen to each other and brainstorm together. So the biggest obstacle for solving problems is kind of like taking the scientists that were back in, centuries ago, didn't have didn't have the internet. And so they couldn't talk to each other. So it was slower. And they mailed each other things. So those letters went over boats, and there's a time frame there before they could talk to each other. And now we have this amazing technology to get together and put all this information together and feed it in and come up with great conclusions. But if we look at solving some of these problems, there's a big chunk of that information that people that make their living on the water have, whether it's fishing or another industry. And then we have a big piece of information that people like me, that people that study the water have. And then we have people that live on the coastline, and they have it. And if you can take those computers that we call brains, and you put them together and you feed all that information in, the potential for figuring out a problem is great. But first we have to remove the lack of trust, the big emotional triggers, and get on the same page and say, look, and I'm finding that that's the biggest obstacle to making things better. To be able to, I've been on boats with fishermen when I've done mitigation work while some of these wind turbines were being installed. And a lot of the guys that were working these boats were from fifth generation fishing families, and they were making some extra money in the off season. And they didn't want to talk to me at first because I'm a scientist. And then we'd start talking, and for some reason, people know that they can trust me. I don't repeat things. I don't judge. And they start showing me pictures of right whales, which are critically endangered. And these are great videos. And they said, yeah, we intentionally positioned our boat so that you couldn't see where we were because we can't talk to, and they would name the agencies that are overseeing all the mitigation. And I would say, but if you reported these on the app and said, this is where we see them, then they could put the information together and tell you, don't put your nets here. We know you don't want to kill whales. We also know you want to feed your family. And if your nets get caught up in these whales, you get negative reactions from the public, you get no cooperation from the agencies, and you'll lose your net. That's a lot of money for you guys. And he looked at me and said, I never thought of it that way. And I think that's the biggest obstacle we have. I would love to be able to just grab them all and shake them and say, stop this. Just talk to each other, because you all have, and it's a foolish errand to ignore the people that work on the water. It's just they have information.
People get very protective in their own little area, and with fear and everything else as well. We see that in a lot of industries, the dive industry being one of them as well.
Mm-hmm.
So how about whale watching and research? How has the increase in popularity of whale watching influenced humpback behavior as well?
Oh, that's a great question. So whale watching is it's great because it provides a lot of data. It's responsible ecotourism in most cases. But then you get into areas of the world where there's small boats that are doing whale watching that are not necessarily doing best practice for these animals, but there are people that are starving and need to make all their money during the whale watching season. So whale watching's provided a lot of great information from a lot of people that can see them consistently, and that helps drive a lot of solutions and answers in science to help do this. But it also brings in recreational boaters that see these big whale watch boats and surround animals, and so there's a problem there that has to be solved. It's always complicated, but we've learned a lot about their social structure. And whale watch boats have seen, let's take the ones in New England, because those are the ones I'm the most familiar with, aside from the small island ones. They go out and they see the same animals all the time. The whale watch industry, the big boats that are licensed to do that up in New England, talk to each other, and they coordinate how much time they're going to spend with these whales. They take those pictures and they submit them to the scientists that are going to analyze them, which ultimately gives the agencies that are going to make policy the best information to do things with. And you get people excited. You get people on the boat to see them for real and go, oh my God, these can't go away. So what can I do? And that's a big driver for a lot of what we do. So I'm a big fan of whale watching. I'm a big fan of responsible ecotourism. And we just need to make that easier than not. That takes some work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Putting a face in a reality to whales is a huge thing. To this day, one of my favorite dives of all time. We did a 3-hour tech dive off the coast of Kona, and the whales had come in, and we spent an hour and a half just loving and listening to their songs. And I can honestly not tip. The only other animal I can tell you that I saw during my dive was some garden eels. I don't remember seeing fish. I don't remember seeing anything else. And we're doing this amazing tech dive off the coast of Hawaii that is 3 hours long. And the thing I remember is the blueness of the water, the whiteness of the sand, and the sun coming in. It put a new reality on whales for me that I hadn't considered. And if they would have kept singing, I probably would have drained my tanks to below my third safety because it was just so amazing, So yes, putting a face and a reality to whales that's outside of Star Trek 4 that we threw on for fun earlier,
right.
And the ambiguous, they're out there somewhere. There's big man,
Right.
putting this reality on it. So I agree completely.
That's why we do so much citizen science stuff. And when we get interns out there as citizen scientists, one of the cool things I love to do is we get the hydrophone in the water and we listen. And if we hear a singer, and this is assuming it's farther away than hearing it through the hull, when we hear a singer, those earphones are about to be passed to somebody who's never heard that before. And nobody is allowed to put those earphones on until my camera is aimed at their face, because everybody does the same thing. No matter how many times I've heard it on a recording, they'll put the earphones on, they'll put the face down like you do when you're concentrating, and then you see their face come up, and then their eyes get big. And usually it's either a mouth drop or tears or whatever, because it's so overwhelming to hear that and know those whales are right there. And in my work, most of the surface close enough, and there's not that many whales, you can say that's the whale we were hearing singing. And that is so overwhelming. And then they go home and tell everybody about it. And we specialize on getting people that have never, ever done any research before. They get on our boat and they're part of the team. They don't get on the boat. It's not a whale watch. We say, you're putting the hydrophone on. Here's how to do it. You collect the data on this. You'll take some pictures on this, measure all different things. They're part of doing the research because it changes people and how they see that animal, that species, and the entire ocean. And now they're part of it. They're not just sitting in the living room somewhere. They're actually part of it. And that makes a big difference.
That's amazing. So I could talk to you for hours, to be honest with you, but I have a few more questions. So let's talk a little bit about future resource. What are the emerging areas of research with humpback whale ecology that you're most excited about?
Oh my gosh. So acoustics is everything right now, which is ironic for me because I'm deaf and I read lips, and people are always shocked about that. What's really cool is that I have a group of collaborators that are, of course, friends. Dr. Seger is one of them. Dr. Joy Reidenberg, who's a comparative anatomist, is another one, where we can meet on Zoom and I can say, okay, I have a crazy idea. I have an hypothesis and I've looked at this inside and out and I can't find a hole in it. I need you to poke holes in it. And then we get together and they take their respective specialties and they look what I'm thinking about. And for me, one of my superpowers is that I can put puzzles together and I see things. And my background is also broader than most people that do what I do. So I can kind of tap into my clinical laboratory background, the pathophysiology, and my psych and behavior background from being a paramedic, and then combine it with all the other things that I've done and say, I think this is what's going on. So for my research, not only are we understanding for the first time some of the dynamics of the humpback whales being the target of predation and the killer whales going after them in the Caribbean. That's a big deal because killer whales are the apex predators. So there's our dove in the canary in the cave type thing. But we've identified some physical characteristics of humpback whales that we've recently done MRIs and CT scans on that'll help us understand better what their communication is. And because I'm deaf, I will take things to Carrie and Joy, and I've done this before, and they'll say, no, that can't happen because of this, which is what you want to start with, and say, but you're thinking like people that can hear. There's more than one way to hear. And so we're on the cusp of being able to identify some new ways that humpback whales perceive sound and communicate with each other. So there's that. And then with killer whales, we're about to publish some really cool stuff about their behaviors underwater that you needed to see to understand what we're seeing from the surface and interpreting it differently because we can see a bigger picture. So those things will happen. Other than that, continuing to look at different behaviors in the Caribbean Ocean, the Caribbean Sea in different areas, and understanding how they're using those communication to be successful. Are they going to continue if the water keeps warming up to migrate down into the Caribbean? Does it matter? We've got more whales. There were about 11,000 in the very late 80s, early 90s that were counted. We haven't done an accurate count since then, but our estimates based on what we know about how they reproduce is probably about 35,000 or more in the North Atlantic from that 11,000. That changes a bunch of things. So those are the things we're looking at. For me, I hope that what I can do is do the next experiment to prove that some of these anatomical features that we've discovered are responsible for communication in a way people will have unexpected. But maybe deaf people won't be so surprised about it, which is kind of cool.
That's wonderful. I love it. Mithriel, I've got a couple questions from viewers that we prepped a little bit ahead of time. So Jason wants to know, he says, I've heard that whales are showing up earlier in Hawaii and the Hawaiian Islands and staying later. Is this true?
I don't know what the behaviors of the whales are in the Hawaiian Islands for humpbacks specifically. I can tell you they are changing. All the populations are changing the timing of where they are, how long they're staying. So people might not know, Jason seems to know, but people might not know that humpback whales feed where the colder waters are. So that's, depending on which hemisphere you're in, that'll be closer to the poles. That's what we call the most productive areas. Cold water tends to have the most priming of the food chain. So they can get the most feed up there. And then they during different seasons in the wintertime, they'll go closer to the equator. So it doesn't matter which hemisphere you're in. So over in Hawaii, wintertime, they're going to the Hawaiian Islands. That's going to shift as the water changes and their food changes. I don't know what the timing is there. I know in the North Atlantic that we're finding trends that they're staying in the feeding grounds longer. Why that is? And humpback whales are notorious for changing timing and location of where they pop up year to year. So I don't know if this will last or not. We'll see. But it makes sense that the trend will follow what the temperatures do.
Absolutely. Chase wanted to know, outside of, I kind of already asked this, but maybe we'll look for another one. But with your extensive experience studying humpback whales, what are some of the emerging topics or groundbreaking research areas at marine biology that you find particularly exciting or relevant to the future of marine conservation?
Conservation is the bottom line. If you can't say why you're doing something, you shouldn't be doing it. And so the whole reason we do all of this is, are each individual species really cool and important, and should we save them? Yes. We always talk about, are they healthy to the ocean? Yes, because like anything that's tied together with all the threads in different places, if you keep snipping at those threads, it all falls apart and unravels. And humpback whales are no different. So for conservation, all research matters. Doesn't matter what species you're studying. For humpback whales, what people may not realize is that humpback whales and other whales that dive deep kind of seed the same food chain that they also benefit from. So whenever they consume something, whatever they don't use goes back into the ocean, right? After they digest it. That actually is important material for starting the whole food chain all over again. So if we start taking out some of these bigger animals, you start snipping at those threads that are connected together in every ecosystem. The most exciting things for me are relating behaviors to acoustics. Every time we can take any behavior and say, this is the sound that relates to it, it means we can go backwards, current, and forward and get a long-term picture of what's been going on, what is going on, and what will be going on, and what that change is. And that change is a huge piece of understanding what we need to do to really help everything survive all this. So I think acoustics is a big thing, but for me, it's acoustics matching behaviors.
That's neat. Well, Mithriel, you've been generous with your time. I wanted to point out you've got a wonderful website. I'm going to throw that up just really quickly as well. And let's see. Let's go back. Let's remove. It's going to add this image. There we go. So if you're interested in knowing more about what Mithriel's doing in the Marine Coastal Ecology Research Centers, they have a wonderful site. I've been flashing it along the bottom throughout this entire interview. It is marine-eco.org. You can also go online and you can hit this wonderful donate button, and you can find out and you can donate to them as well. And so we just hit donate. And make sure you can donate. You donate to their cause. It's marine ecology. This is, we as divers, this is the environment we've chosen to be within, and we love for a reason. We don't go because we want to see just sand. We want to see cool things, turtles and whales and sharks and everything else. And so make sure you're donating to this. Click on this, donate to the MCERC. They've got, want to tell us a little bit about your trolley here you've got going on?
Yeah, so we have two big projects going on. This is Seymour. That's a nod to different cultures. So C and then more is also C in some other languages. That's our project that's being renovated into a rolling classroom so that we can actually take some of what we do into other areas, anything by land that we can get to. It's really cool and it gets a lot of attention. So it's empty right now except for the driver's seat, and it's going to be filled for different projects in different areas and get people who might not get to see what we do to get some hands-on stuff. We have a program in November that we'll be doing Bones and Stones, where we do some evolutionary biology and put together some bones and understand how they work with all different animals. So that's a big project we have. And then we just very generously donated a small boat, a Willard, 24-foot, that is in California now, and this was a surprise 2 weeks ago. That will be a game changer for our research in the Gulf of Mexico that we're kicking up now to do more studies on whales and be able to take citizen scientists out with us as well as interns. And so now we're working on doing some fundraising for that so we can bring it on that drive across the country to where we are. So all the money that gets donated to us, any grants, whatever we get, goes to all our education and research efforts and to try to get everybody involved who wants to be.
Exciting. So if I wanted to take a ride on Seymour when he is completed, I assume is he, where would I go to ride Seymour?
You'll know from our website or any of our social media. That's where we post everything.
Absolutely. So make sure to follow the Marine and Coastal Ecology Research Center on social media as well. Links in the show notes as well. Mithriel, thank you. I love these conversations because I learn so much. I hope other people do as well, but I enjoyed it thoroughly. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, and count me as a resource for anybody who wants to reach out. I'm easy to find. I'm happy to answer questions.
Absolutely. Well, there you go. Dr. Mithriel MacKay, amazing researcher, just wonderful to talk with. Make sure to go to her website, support their cause, and go to Disney Plus, Hulu, and Nat Geo, and watch Ocean Explorers. I mean, this is just neat stuff. They gave them basically a blank check and a cool ship and said, do it. How neat is that? You can't ask for much more than that, that's for sure. Well, again, my name is Benjamin Hatfield. Teach me to dive. If you like this kind of content, make sure to like and subscribe to our channel. We are on YouTube, social media, of course, Facebook and Instagram, TikTok, all that fun stuff. Come in. If you have questions for people like Mithriel, reach out to us. We will happily forward your questions over to them as well. Again, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.